So, welcome to the Anything Everything podcast. Back again, Tarek and myself. Today's topic is procrastination.
Yes.
What do you think about that, Tarek?
Procrastination is big. So I remember back in university, I used to procrastinate all the time. And I'm sure viewers listening to this can really, really relate to the whole concept of procrastination. I think most people, if not all, at some point in their lives struggle with procrastination. So it'll be really interesting to dive into the whole topic of procrastination and why we tend to procrastinate. What is it about putting off tasks that's so alluring to us?
Yeah.
Why do we always do it? When we know deep down that if we actually sit down and do a task, it's usually better to get it done earlier. But instead, we chase things that we probably shouldn't be chasing, and we tend to put off tasks till later. So it's a topic that I think a lot of people can resonate with. And I'm really, really excited to dive deep into it because I think we have, like from what I've explored, I don't know what you have over there, but you do seem to have a lot of notes. I think that we can add a lot of value for people and give them some tips as well on how to manage procrastination if they really struggle a lot with it. So yeah,
absolutely. I think it's also quite fitting because we're bringing up this topic around the time where people are going back to university and school.
Yeah.
So the summer is over now. People are going back, and
dude, the weather though, it's still super hot. I hope summer gets over soon.
Well, they can't procrastinate about going to school or university.
Yeah.
So
true.
So they're fixed on that. So I'll start by defining procrastination.
Yeah.
And then we can see how we can steer our way around how external factors affect us, and then we'll find our way slowly towards the internal side of the mind and why do we really procrastinate.
Nice. So how would you define procrastination?
So procrastination is defined as a voluntary, unnecessary delay of an important task that you have, despite knowing that you're going to be worse off for doing so. So we're actively delaying.
Right. We know that we're delaying, and we're doing it on purpose.
And we are. Right? So I think we can start by looking at, the way the world is now, the modern world, is that we have a lot of distractions. There are a lot of distractions, and I think a lot of people would use this excuse that, I can't seem to focus because there's just so much in the world out there on media or whatever that is taking my attention, right? So we're in the attention economy. Everything is about your attention.
Yeah.
So that certainly plays on people's minds. So what do you think? Is it a matter of distractions alone? Or?
I think a lot of it is distraction. The one thing that I'm trying to reconcile is with the advent of social media, these very quick distractions are much easier to come by. Yeah. So does that mean that now in the modern age, compared to, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago, is it a much bigger problem? Procrastination, I mean. Is it much more prevalent in today's society because of how much distractions we have around us? So if you think about it, maybe 50 years ago, what would someone do if they want to procrastinate? They might, clean the house. They might do something like read. So right now you can just pick up your phone and open something that usually you're really interested in and get that distraction that way. So I'm wondering if there's like some sort of correlation with the advent of social media and the increased procrastination.
100%. I tend to agree with that, especially with social media and the personal phone, the personal laptop.
It just increased distractions, didn't it?
Certainly did.
And I definitely agree that distraction is probably the biggest external factor for probably the only one actually for procrastination that comes from outside.
Yeah, and while we can see that where we are now, as you were saying, we're looking back 50 years ago, 100 years ago, maybe even before, because procrastination is something that even the Greeks have spoken about. But did they have that level of distraction that we have? I think instinctively we want to say no, because they just didn't have phones.
Yeah.
Right? And could you really procrastinate on like important tasks back in the day that you needed to do because maybe they were more time bound? Now we can procrastinate and we can get away with it. I think that's the danger in it as well, is that we procrastinate for students and in university and high school. They can get away with it because you can cram the night before an exam and still make it. So the consequences aren't so dire nowadays, even though it's more prevalent, perhaps.
Do we know that the consequences were dire back in the ancient times?
I'm just thinking about it because, okay, what tasks did they have that they needed to do, right? You'd argue that, a blacksmith or a farmer or, so on and so forth, they had tasks that they needed to do for survival, perhaps, or for their job.
Right.
So could you really procrastinate? Or let's say you made a deal with someone for a certain item you need to fashion in time, and you didn't tell them, be here at 2 p.m., right? It wasn't that level of detail, but you had to do it for your livelihood, right? So it was more about survival. I tend to feel that they couldn't really procrastinate as much because it was tied to their, survival and, food security.
I think that makes sense because there's much more pressure, I guess, on people to do their jobs and to actually do the work. Much more pressure than there is now.
Probably,
so that
right?
probably reduces the risk of procrastination. But if they talked about it back then I'm sure it was still a problem.
It was, for sure. Yeah. But again, we're looking at
The
the
prevalence.
thinkers and the thinkers, right? The people that aren't the common person. Like when you look
Like
at
philosophers
Exactly.
and scholars and those types of...
I mean, they had helpers, right? That helped them do things as well. They lived a sort of a, high status life.
So you mentioned thinkers. Do you think there is like a correlation with the type of task or the type of job and procrastination?
It may be the case, yeah. It certainly may be. Again, think about when you have to do something, what is the feedback when you don't do it? The feedback for something really dire could have been no food, could have been someone replaces you immediately, right? Nowadays, it's maybe the consequences aren't that dire. At least in, like in school, you can get out of it. If you're a bit late, you can go speak to your teacher and so on. In university as well. In jobs, okay, it's not as serious, but people could lose their jobs if it's a pattern, right?
So the higher the risk, the less likely procrastination is a problem.
Probably, yeah. I tend to see it that way. And maybe the risk was much higher back in the day.
For some people, definitely.
Yeah.
I think there's still high risk for a lot of people in today's society that have jobs that they can't miss or they can't procrastinate on.
Yeah, like the jobs that need alertness all the time.
Yeah.
Air traffic control, emergency. You can't procrastinate when there's an emergency.
You can't. Even if you're working like at a warehouse somewhere, or if you're working in construction, you can probably procrastinate a little bit, but ultimately output is very measurable in these situations.
Yeah, exactly.
But a lot of desk jobs that we have today, that probably a lot of them didn't exist way back when, it's not as hard, it's not as clear cut, like what the output is, how much work you're putting in.
Exactly.
Especially now with remote work, there isn't someone looking over your shoulder and analyzing whether or not you're working. So it just makes it much easier to procrastinate.
100%. And it's the service industry, what you're referring to, essentially.
Yeah.
Is that when we moved from sort of manufacturing to service, which is more prevalent now in the economy, is that you actually have license to procrastinate more.
Yeah.
So it protects you.
Yeah.
So we're,
and being at home and working from home, it's just
100%.
imagine how easy it is to get distracted. No one's looking at you.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. So one of the other aspects I think that comes up a lot around procrastination. So we've talked about distractions, perfectionism. Perfectionism is a big one for me personally, and I think it's quite common with a lot of people. I think, and if you asked me a few years ago, I would probably use it as an excuse. I find it now a weak excuse for procrastinating. Oh, I'm a perfectionist.
Explain how it's related.
It's related because when you want to do a task, you're put off by maybe not being clear on the output of that task and how much you can contribute and how to get it to the final stage. And so you kind of use this lazy excuse that I'm a perfectionist, I want it to be perfect, and you don't end up doing anything. I think that's what's common, is that by procrastinating, you're not putting it off for a point in time where you know that I'm going to get a good output. You're putting off indefinitely, and you might not even do anything. And it's not going to be your best work anyways. So that's how I've experienced it, at least.
So why would you delay starting a task if you're a perfectionist? What's the intrinsic reason? What inside you makes you feel like I don't want to start it now? Is it the uncertainty about the output, or is it something else? Like, what's going on internally for you when you're thinking, okay, I'm a perfectionist, but then also something creeps in that makes you put off whatever you need to do?
Looking back, and obviously now sort of countered it, it was around what is known now as abstract goal setting. When you set a goal for something and it's abstract and you're not clear how to start and how to sort of proceed, that's how I've fallen into that perfectionist trap. Is that I've put here's an example. In university, which, we both attended the same university. Let's say there's a midterm coming up in one week. And I would put a sticky note, and say, study math 201.
Okay.
Which is,
a tough course.
A tough course, which we know, and not a specific plan at all. It's far from it, right?
Yeah, study math 201. There's nothing tangible.
At all.
Yeah.
So that idea of, okay, I keep telling myself, I look at the book, I rearrange the book sitting on the desk. You end up cleaning around, in the house. And there's actually a term for that called procrastinating or procrastinating, where you come to, and I think this is tied to perfectionism, is that when you come to study or prepare or do a task, your mind tells you, and it's part of distractions as well, that let me clean and have the perfect environment before starting. And you end up
because
delaying.
it'll make you work better. That's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
I think so.
Where it just keeps repeating.
And it might help you work better. I think some people, perhaps they need a good environment. They need it to be sort of clean and perfect before starting, but it does put you off. It certainly affects you.
And you can also take it way overboard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
So
do you have any experiences around that with perfectionism?
I wouldn't say I'm a perfectionist per se. So I was always someone who is, back in university, I was always someone who was content to just do the bare minimum.
Okay. So you found a way to do, enough to start at least. Because I wasn't able to start at times. And I think that's an issue.
The only way that I found I was able to start is when the pressure becomes way too intense for me to manage.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would always be procrastinating, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, I could just study a couple of hours before the exam. And usually what happens is the exam day would be the next day and I still haven't studied and I still haven't done anything. And I pull an all-nighter because that's the only way I'd have time to study.
Yeah.
So a week before the exam, I'm like, okay, I'm not really familiar with the material, but I know based on historically how I've done exams and how I've performed, I know that I can probably put it off for a couple of days. That's 1 week before the exam. 2 or 3 days later, I'm like, I have a glance at the material required for the exam. And I'm like, this looks pretty easy. So I could put it off for another day or two.
Yeah.
Another day or another 2 days, a bunch of distractions come by. I'm like, let me just do this thing. Let me just do this thing. And suddenly it's the night before the exam and I still haven't studied. And
the clock starts ticking. Yeah.
Yeah, but the whole time I've been putting it off voluntarily. I know in the back of my head that this is something that I need to do. But then a night before the exam, the pressure really starts to accumulate in my head. Like, okay, there's nothing. I can't just put it off anymore. I have no option. I need to study. So I cram before the exam and I go to the exam. But never in my head do I think I need to get the best grade possible or I need to be the top performer at the university. This was back in my school and university days. I've changed a lot since then. Now,
good.
yeah, because otherwise, I'd be probably performing really badly at work. But I think one of the main things when it comes to procrastinating and reasons we procrastinate is also how invested you are in what you're doing. I think that's a big part of it as well. And that's also internal. In university, I wasn't invested in learning.
It's about the motivation.
The stuff that I was learning wasn't stuff that interested me. And it wasn't stuff that I saw tangible value from. In fact, what I wanted to do was ditch studying completely. If it weren't for my parents, I wouldn't have even finished university. I would have dropped out from year one.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to start my own business and I wanted to try to hustle and make money. I didn't want a college education. So that as well really contributed to the fact that I kept putting off tasks, and probably also contributed in the lack of me caring whether or not I do really well. So perfectionism didn't really come into play for me.
Okay. No, good. And your point around cramming till the last sort of day, there's an interesting sort of profiling done by a psychologist called Joseph Ferrari in University of Chicago.
Okay.
And he grouped procrastinators under 3 buckets.
Okay.
Thrill seekers, which I think you fall in that regard, into that bucket. Avoiders, and then thirdly, indecisives.
Avoidance, thrill seeking, and decisiveness.
Right. So I think you're on the thrill seeking side because of your, you like that stress, you're able to, and there's that, there's a reward loop that you give yourself.
Yeah.
Because when it works, you keep telling yourself that, okay,
I can do it.
I can do it. Certainly. I think I've fallen more under the indecisives at times where I wasn't able to just take a decision and go like, okay, am I going to study? Am I going to do this? What am I going to do? And that obviously adds up to the stress and builds up.
I'd like to just dive into those a bit more because they sound really interesting. So when you say thrill seeking, it just means that number one, you're probably a risk taker.
Yep.
So you enjoy the feeling of a risk versus a reward. Number two, you're kind of more confident or maybe overconfident about your ability to deliver under pressure. Mm-hmm. So those two are probably characteristic of being a thrill seeker because pressure gives you a thrill.
Yep.
So postponing things to the last minute add a lot of pressure, which gives you that thrill and makes you much more anxious, probably raises your cortisol levels in your body.
Yep.
And that kind of thrill and adrenaline and anxiety pushes you to work harder and maybe sometimes even pushes you to do your best work in some cases.
Yeah, it may be the case that you're just sort of like gathering all this energy in a focused manner. And yeah, you handle the stress well.
Yeah, I think it's a very fine thing to balance, though. I don't think it's easy to balance because you need to really understand what kind of effort you need to put in to reach the optimal outcome. So that's thrill seeking. Indecisiveness, how does that work?
So there's an inability to take a decision. You're not able to juggle the number of decisions you have to do. And you don't know where to start, you don't know what to prioritize, and so on. So it's more around maybe the time management aspect.
Yeah.
The avoiders are, I think it's more around the judgment side, where you feel like you have doubt in your abilities, you're not very confident, you have a bit of insecurity. So that also plays on, like how confident you are in an exam.
Yeah.
Even if you have 2 weeks to go, like, for example, maths, right? Maths is a disaster. And people actively say that I'm not a math person.
Yeah, or I'm not good at maths.
Yeah, it's like the most course or topic that people associate an identity with, that I'm just not a math person.
Yeah.
Which we can get into, actually. It jumps us nicely into, another segment. There's a book by a doctor called Barbara Oakley. The book is called Mind for Numbers. And it essentially covers her struggles with learning math and science in university and so on. And it goes through sort of her journey overcoming that and understanding how the mind works in order to help students with math and science.
Okay.
And it's really interesting. Now, what she talked about with math students specifically, and she notes this in the book, is that they've done studies on math students, and they found that these medical imagery on the brain, they show that the pain areas light up when thinking about maths. That's how much it causes sort of trauma to your mind.
Which is why they end up procrastinating due to avoidance.
100%.
They're avoiding pain.
Yeah, it's purely,
literally
like
the
fight
pain.
or flight in a sense, right?
Yeah,
you want to avoid
section of the brain.
You want to avoid pain. And moving on with that point, they found that the pain of anticipation is greater than the pain of action. So when you start doing, the pain actually wears off. It subsides. Insane. And then this is summarized really nicely by another sort of procrastination expert that says the dread of doing a task actually consumes time and effort more than doing it.
Yeah.
So look how much we focus and we dwell on just thinking about the task and how much it affects us.
The anticipation anxiety is a big thing.
Right.
Anticipation anxiety is known that your anticipation of a certain outcome or a certain event is almost always worse than the event itself. Yeah. For example, anticipation anxiety when you're about to get on stage and give a speech. This has nothing to do with procrastination, but it just kind of ties back in to the fact that when you're anticipating something, it can really hurt and it can really torment you emotionally. And it's the same with people who avoid tasks, I guess, and that's why they procrastinate. Like in their heads, they're probably like, I know I need to study and I really want to study, but their brain is just giving them these pain signals, which makes them much, much more likely to get distracted by menial things and end up putting off the task until it's too late. Whereas in reality, I think most people by far, if they put their minds to it and they study, they could pass math and they could understand it, right? Like I think the threshold for the mathematics, at least, that it doesn't go too deep into the theoretical realm, you can understand it if you study. And if you 100%. Don't want to understand it, you can study and memorize certain formulas and still pass and do well. Like people in university that study a lot, not necessarily math people, as in they're not inclined naturally as people to understand the logic of math, would still pass mathematics. So it's just because they learned how to keep procrastination at bay and to battle that pain of avoidance and overcome it and just sit and study. But then there are probably people who are more prone to it than others.
100%. And I think especially with math, because there's a huge practice element, right? More than maybe other courses. Because other courses are reading based, much more reading based. You can't study math by reading it. You study other courses by reading them. Math is, once you get that sort of what they call activation energy and you just get into the zone, I found that you actually enjoy studying math more than other courses. It took me a while, but I found that enjoyment after a bit. You put music, you can waste an hour or two on equations. Once you get the gist of it, it's just about practice. And obviously, we're simplifying it way more. I wish I had this mindset in university.
Yeah, same.
You remember the course Math 201, for example?
Yeah.
I mean, that was a nightmarish course for people.
Yeah, most people had struggled a lot with it.
Yeah, if there's any course that caused trauma. And I think it's probably the most course that was repeated, at least for sophomore students.
I would say it's probably is. Right? It probably is. Most course that's repeated. I know a shitload of people who have failed the course and had to do it again. And it's required for a lot of majors.
Yeah, it was for, in our case, economics and engineering. So so you have a whole, two major faculties that needed to rely on it. It's crazy. And so I mean, we're going around. We started off with distractions. We started off with looking at perfectionism, and we've reached this point where it's really about the emotions. We've been circling a little bit, and it really comes down to, this is what sort of neuroscientists now tell us, is that it's a matter of emotional regulation rather than time management. It's really just about your emotions. And there's a neuroscientist called Nawal Mustafa. She talked about three sort of kind of subsets of why procrastination happens. All right. Firstly, it's about managing or inability to manage negative emotions. Okay. And your negative mood. Secondly, it's about instant gratification, pleasure principle. And then thirdly is about the present bias. So I think we can sort of deconstruct each one of those. We talked a bit about negative moods. It seems to be around self-doubt, insecurities, and anxiety, right? And what we do is we put off that bad feeling, the pain, right? Because of, okay, I don't feel very well now. I'm not very confident about this course. Let me postpone it and I'll do something that feels good. And this is where the pleasure principle comes in, right? Is that you reward yourself. This is where it really gets tricky, is that what happens is you put off a task that you should do, and then you reward yourself by doing something that is instant gratification.
Gives you a dopamine hit.
And it's purely the pleasure principle, where you're pushing away pain and you're getting pleasure. And that creates maybe a sort of dissonance in your mind, because that cycle.
There's a reward.
For
procrastinating.
So your mind likes procrastination. It ends up liking it, and it's a habit that you can't really break, because by not doing this task, I'm getting a reward. So you see how it can be. This is why I think it's so chronic and it's hard to really distill and overcome for students.
Yeah, not just students, adults.
And adults as well, right? I think,
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what the metric is, but I do know that the poll that we posted on our Instagram account about whether or not people tend to procrastinate, most people, I think it was, what was it, 60% or 70%? Maybe, I don't remember what the numbers were, maybe even more than that.
I think more than 60%, yeah.
Said that they do struggle with procrastination.
Yeah.
So
We put it in a sort of funny way. There were 3 options. The first option is I do all my tasks on time.
yeah. And we had 2 people out of 16
10%, 2 out of 20.
2 out of 20.
Yeah, 2 out of 20 said, I think, and again, they're probably joking about that. The majority said, I put the pro in procrastination.
Yeah, which is,
Yeah.
they struggle with procrastination, basically.
And then a few rather, comically as well said, can I answer this later?
Yeah, so that was the third choice. I think the comic part was you, because you put those choices
Oh,
up.
no, I didn't vote. I left it for others.
No, but you had that choice. So the choice of I'll answer this later was one that you... I would have probably put that choice. I didn't answer the poll either, but that would have been my choice. I'll answer it later.
No, exactly.
But I mean, that tells you as well that it's a procrastination thing. It's like a comedy sort of approach to saying that I procrastinate. So we know that a lot of adults also struggle with it.
Yeah.
I know that I think the difference between being an adult and being a student is probably because when you're an adult, you have a lot more responsibilities. So you know that there's much more risk if you procrastinate.
Yeah, again, back to consequences, right?
There are much more dire consequences.
Yeah,
that doesn't mean
and everything.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that we're immune to procrastination or that we don't procrastinate. I think a lot of us, me included, struggle with trying to overcome the day-to-day pull of procrastination. Personally, I still procrastinate sometimes, and I do it knowingly because I tend to be someone who works better under pressure.
Which we highlighted.
Yeah, we highlighted that.
Yeah.
And my job is a pretty high pressure job at the moment, which means that I'm fulfilled at my job, and it doesn't leave me much room to procrastinate because there's always something pressing that I need to get to.
Okay.
And the fact that I work really well under pressure and I'm working in a very high pressure environment made me really excel at my job. Okay. So I think what this comes to is, if you're someone who knows that you struggle with procrastination, maybe you can find something that kind of complements that part of you.
Yeah, that unique style of,
You have
While we all have it as the same, there are certain,
if you
factors.
understand your weaknesses and you come to terms with them and you accept them, and then you start diving into ways where you could not necessarily combat them, but instead embrace them and do your best work knowing what kind of things can distract you and why you tend to fall into the procrastination trap, that'll be something that would help you. But I also want to say that a lot of people think that people who procrastinate are lazy.
Okay.
And there's a correlation in people's minds that laziness equals procrastination. In fact, even I had that correlation in my head until very recently when I learned more about procrastination. If you had asked me a couple of weeks ago, back in university, were you lazy? I would have told you 100% I was a super lazy person.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between laziness and procrastination now that I read about it. And the fundamental difference is, if you're lazy, you're putting off something and you don't care about whether or not you do it.
Okay.
There's no intent of doing a specific task. If you have to write an essay or if you have to do a project for work, some sort of PowerPoint presentation, if you're lazy, you're going to do stuff and get distracted by things. And in your mind, you're like, I don't care if I finish this presentation or not. If I don't finish it, I'll just tell my boss I had to do something else and I'll finish it next week. If you're procrastinating, in the back of your mind, there's always something tugging at it. There's always something pulling you and telling you, yo, there's this thing and you need to do it. But for whatever reason, bunch of reasons we outlined, whatever your procrastination style is, you tend to put it off. But you always know that you're going to do that task and you always intend to do that task. However, because procrastination is such a tricky thing, it might end up affecting the quality of your work if you put it off for too long. So that's the difference between laziness and procrastination. So if you feel like you're someone who procrastinates,
very normal. Yeah.
It's normal. A lot of us are affected by it. Don't put yourself down and say that you're lazy, because laziness is something else. If you don't care about what you're doing, you don't care about completing a certain task, then yeah, you're lazy. But if you do care about it, and there are things that you feel almost are out of your control, and you just keep getting distracted, then it's procrastination, and it's not really laziness. And I really like that because it helped me kind of feel better about what procrastination is. And it also helps, to probably overcome procrastination when you have that kind of attitude towards it.
No, and it's a good point because you kind of talk about that self-talk. Part of it is understanding the task and your relationship with it and the intent. And one of the things perhaps that we can get into a little bit around the tips and what they say is you need to forgive yourself. We know we procrastinate. You're never going to do everything that you need to do and all the tasks you have. So you have to forgive yourself. There's an angle around self-compassion that is backed up by research that you'll do better when you instill that feeling that, okay, I know I'm not going to complete everything, so it's fine. You kind of, don't beat yourself up too much.
Let's try to dissect why that would be. So if you forgive yourself, there are two things that I'm thinking about here. One thing is, if you procrastinate and you forgive yourself, do you fall into some sort of situation where you're kind of way too easy on yourself and you start forgiving yourself for procrastinating more and more, and that kind of feeds into itself, and you become a chronic procrastinator because you're because you're forgiving yourself? Or is it, if you don't forgive yourself, there's too much added stress on your brain, and that pain part of your brain is much more activated, so you're much more likely to get distracted if you don't forgive yourself because there's so much added pressure and stress on your head. I think there's a balance.
Definitely. I mean, the latter is more of a negative, vicious cycle, right? That if you stay in that, it's hard to get out. Now, I think if you start with the forgive yourself and move towards the center where you forgive yourself, but again, it's how much, right? You can't, be too forgiving, and because things have to be done.
Exactly.
You have to get things done, or shit done, as they say. But if you're stuck in that negative cycle, we know that the stress is bad. We know that for most people, you don't really handle the stress well. So it's better to just avoid that and move towards the angle of, or the direction of, forgiving yourself and compassion, and juggle. And again, it's about knowing that you can't do everything. You really can't. Time is limited for whatever it is. You're bound by other factors, things outside of your control, and the urgency of certain things. You can't handle that. You can't juggle it, or you can't set it. There are things that just other people set for you, and you just have to go with it.
Okay.
But at least for your own tasks, you know that, okay, for example, we talk about this all the time, even for this podcast, there are things that we manage delay, in a sense, which is a nice way of saying procrastination. We manage delay. Now, not sure, we still have a bit of time. There was one point I wanted to bring up around, the third point around emotional regulation. And there's a nice story around that, present bias. Now, present bias is how we feel disconnected from our future selves. Okay, and there are studies that tell us that on a neural level, we actually view our future self as like a different person. And that's part of why we procrastinate as well, is that the connection isn't there. It's perhaps maybe a sort of dissonance as well, but it's just it's like who you are now, and I'll give you a nice example about it, and who you are tomorrow are almost different people.
It's why we struggle so much with delayed gratification.
100%. And thinking long term, right? It's from a neurological point of view, it's tough. And I think it goes back to sort of how they understand the mind. We have sort of three systems. The mind there's the two sort of archaic. There are like limbic and the reptilian. And then you have the prefrontal, which has evolved much more recently,
right?
Relatively more recent. That's involved in self-control, involved in long-term planning, involved in restraint. And we have a hard time balancing that with our animalistic instincts, right? And the example is actually from Jerry Seinfeld. I hope you. I hope you don't know this. Okay.
Oh, perfect. maybe I don't know it. Yeah.
If you've seen the show Seinfeld, I haven't seen most of it, but I've seen this clip. So he has a bit at the beginning of the episode where he says, "Okay, so I have a problem. I struggle because I have night guy and I have morning guy. So I have night Jerry, and I have morning Jerry. Night Jerry wants to stay up, have fun, and enjoy himself. Morning Jerry hates Night Jerry because morning Jerry never gets enough sleep. So there's this constant battle between Night Jerry and Morning Jerry, and Morning Jerry just says that guy sucks. So the only thing Morning Jerry can do is to stay in late and miss his job so that Night Jerry gets fired and then can't stay up late anymore. Sort of something like that.
That makes sense. It makes sense. It's like your future self is different. I think the tendency and the way consciousness is in general is that you're living in the moment, right? If you look at much more primitive brains, that of animals, they're just in the moment the whole time. They have no concept of future. If you think about a dog, the dog is just like now. Like if you try to teach delayed gratification to a dog, you could see them struggle. Like if you put a treat in front of them and you ask them to wait, they're struggling. Like, it's really tough. And you can train them to delay gratification, but ultimately they know that they're going to be gratified. And if they don't delay gratification, they're not getting the gratification that they're going to get. So, and I think our brains are just an evolved version of that primitive brain, which
100%.
means that despite all the intelligence that we have, we're still people who live in the moment.
Yeah, we fall victim to that.
We think too much about the future, and there's some studies that say if you're someone who dwells too much on the future, you tend to be an anxious person. If you're someone who dwells too much on the past, you tend to be a depressed person. And if you're someone who lives in the moment, generally you're more healthy mentally. So
there are nuances within those.
There
as
are
well.
definitely nuances,
but generally, yeah.
But that's like a general, you could say, rule of thumb.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, when it comes to procrastination, you kind of have to think about the future state, right?
Yeah.
Even though living in the moment is much more enticing, that distraction that's at your fingertips now, which is your phone, you can watch a video that's going to make you laugh. What's nicer than a dopamine hit from a chuckle or a laugh or seeing a really, really cute cat on a video? You know, those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
They're just going to give your brain, like we said earlier, those dopamine hits, and they're right here, and they're right now, and they're right at your fingertips. The massive 50-slide PowerPoint presentation
isn't going anywhere, and it's not doing anything for you.
Exactly. And even when you start it and you do that first slide and that second slide, there isn't that loop in your head that's giving you dopamine hits, that's rewarding you for finishing the first slide and the second slide. The reward is going to come later when you finish all 50 and you rehearse it and you're like, I'm going to crush this thing. But our brains, they're not wired like that.
100%.
You have to kind of train it. Right? You have to train your brain to think that way.
Yeah, you have to hack.
So how do we go about changing this wiring?
So there are a number of hacks, and some I've used, and obviously from research. So I have 4 main ones, and curious to see how you feel about these or additional ones. The first one I find is there has to be something around action. Is that how can I get activation energy? How can I immerse myself into starting something? And there's a colleague of mine that gave me this actually a few years ago, the 2-minute rule. If something you think can take 2 minutes, do it immediately. Do not push it away. Do not postpone it. Jump in, get it out of the way. Answer that email, upload that file, whatever it is, do it if it's 2 minutes. So it's a quick, like heuristic, jump into it. The next is, I think, a bit more, about around planning and long term, is about you have to have a plan. You have to have a plan for your week. With our jobs, with other jobs as well, it's overwhelming. You can't memorize everything. Your attention span is all over the place. You can't really hold things in your working memory, too many things as well. So you have to be good at planning. You have to get into that. Thirdly, specificity. And this is where we talked about the abstract goal setting, is that when I told myself, study 201, I didn't touch the book for 4 days. 4 days because I didn't know what to do beyond.
You had too broad of a goal.
It lacked specificity. I needed to go like, okay, how many chapters are there? This chapter, how many pages? What's my assessment of how long each chapter will take? Okay, how can I break this down according to the plan? So you need that level of specificity. And then finally, one that's a bit more sort of amusing and has a historical, background and story is the Pomodoro technique. The pomodoro is Italian for tomato, and it was invented by a chef who used to put a tomato-shaped timer and use it to time different activities in the kitchen.
Okay.
So I use that now for like, on the watch, 25 minutes. I'm going to do this task, put a playlist or something.
So you time box things.
You have to time box. It helps me a lot, to do tasks, and then reward yourself. You need that cycle of, sort of like the Pavlovian view is that I'm going to do the timer. When I'm done, stand up, change your environment, give yourself a reward.
How do you reward yourself?
By moving away. Put the laptop away, put the book away, whatever it is you're doing, change the environment, change the setting, and that creates a habit. It's a habit loop, right? Do that action and change. So that has worked for me.
Okay.
What about you?
So I think time boxing is super important. If I know that there's a task at hand, generally I try to figure out that I want to spend, let's say, less than 1 hour on this. If I hit the 1 hour mark and it's still not finished, I'm going to stop. And I'm going to note it down that I need to come back to it, and I'm going to start something else. And then I'm going to end up coming back to it. And I assess it's not always easy, but I kind of assess the size of tasks before I engage in them based on how I think I'm going to approach the end goal. Yeah. So definitely time boxing helps. And when I time box, I also leave like, I don't need to punish myself. If I feel like I'm spending too long on a specific task and there's something else I'm not able to do because of this, it removes away the loop that, and I always have in my head that it's okay if the 1 hour passes and I don't get to where I need to get. The other thing, that's fine, but the other thing that I have in my mind is I'm going to do whatever I can to get this done inside 1 hour.
Okay.
And sometimes that means that what I put out is not of perfect quality. And again, I'm not a perfectionist. I'm someone who really values output and efficiency. Yes. Efficiency is my number one thing. So time boxing makes me really efficient. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I would say I do to be efficient is I have a very, very simple note taker on the side. Mm-hmm. And I always put down the things that I need to get done in order of importance.
Nice.
So I have the importance of the tasks and what I need to get done. Mm-hmm. And there's always something that I need to get done. And I keep it in front of me. So I have a screen where that note is always in my face.
Yeah, dashboard.
Because if I don't see it, I could out of sight, out of mind, distracted, instant gratifications, the whole day is gone. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Boom, 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 snowball.
Yeah. And I could, if it's not in front of me and I don't see how big the list is, I kind of tend to procrastinate. So I manufacture pressure for myself.
Okay.
What that means is if my list of tasks isn't as long, or I only have 1 or 2 tasks that I need to do, and I feel like they're high priority, I procrastinate because I'm like, I know I could do these in 2 hours.
Interesting.
I have an 8-hour day, so I'm just going to wait till the last 2 hours to do them.
So when you have less things, you actually procrastinate more.
100%.
Okay.
So what I do now is I manufacture pressure, and I know I'm doing it, but it's working for me.
It's a hack.
I find things to do throughout the day.
Okay.
I'm like, this would be really good to do. This would be really good to do. This would be really good to do. And the list becomes 8 things that I need to do over the day. Okay. The top 2 are priority, but I know I need to do the other 6 because they're really good things that I need to get done.
Okay.
But I kind of manufacture them. They're not tasks that are there.
Interesting.
And that are given to me.
Is that for momentum building?
That is for pressure adding.
Okay.
So if I add pressure I pressure myself to perform because I know that I perform well under pressure. And I'm the procrastinator type that's the risk taker, the thrill seeker. That's the way I procrastinate. So I learned.
To stay busy.
I think that's kind of, it happened more intuitively than it did because I really read into how it happens. I think intuitively because I know that I'm going to waste time and put off tasks if I don't have a challenge in front of me. I'm giving myself challenges because it's really important to me to be a top performer at my job.
Yeah.
And this is what keeps me going. And this is what keeps pressure added. And it also helps that my job is a high pressure environment.
So they are compliments, yeah.
But yeah, that's one thing that, I feel really helps me. I don't know if it'll help everyone. I think for some people doing that would add too much stress and would actually be a detriment to their procrastination. Because some people under pressure tend to procrastinate more because of the avoidance. If they're an avoidant type of procrastinator, that's not the way to go about it. It's probably better to do precise goal setting for those people.
That's the thing. And you need to find what works for you ultimately, because there isn't one, a rule that just gets it for everyone.
Yeah.
And then it's interesting, you found these like just your own hacks to be able to get it.
And
because it's about, and to summarize, your first point is progress over perfection. You just need to keep the momentum up, keep doing things, stay productive.
And I think it's important even for people who are perfectionists to forgive themselves if things aren't perfect, like we said. Because really, what is perfect? It's a subjective concept that's never really attainable. I don't think in our world, perfection is
100%.
attainable. The only thing that we can consider perfect is logic, right? If you think of mathematics, because it's if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. That's I guess, perfect because it's logical. But otherwise, if you're thinking of stuff that are more abstract, what is perfection if it's subjective?
There isn't. Just before we wrap up, there's I think we have a few minutes. There's 2 points I want to raise. And again, we tend to do this. There's a lot of lessons from history. And one of them is a term that the Greeks came up with that defines procrastination a little bit differently, a bit more deeper. And it's called Akrasia. Have you heard of it?
Akrasia?
Akrasia or Akrasia?
Yeah, I haven't heard of it, but...
Okay, so Akrasia is acting against your better judgment. And it's when you know that you should be doing something, but you resist doing it and you almost never end up doing it. It's when you say, I should start working out. I should start focusing on my food. It's that kind of, narrative to yourself. And it's a bit deeper than just procrastination. It's a form of it. And I think procrastination emerged from the word, but it's a little bit different. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I know that I've struggled with something like that before, and I know a lot of people have. And that's probably why New Year's resolutions are so big.
Yeah.
It's because you put off something and you're like, okay, new year, new me kind of thing, which also feeds into the fact that the future you is someone else, like new year, new me. What does that even mean? You're still going to be you when January the 1st hits.
Yeah.
So what can we do to stop putting off tasks to the point where we don't do them? And if it's not a task, it's more of like a habit that you want to build, for example. Because you can procrastinate building good habits as well. Going to the gym, eating well, waking up in the morning and making your bed, that kind of stuff. So would that be the same thing? Like concrete goal setting, the Pomodoro technique?
Yeah. How to start? I think ultimately it's about the starting, because the start it gives you that energy. You get motivation.
How do you get that motivation to start?
It depends on the task, but for me, again, the 2-minute rule. Like, how do you, instead of going to the gym and thinking I need to do an hour, start by doing 5 push-ups. Again, it's just about and this is to quote James Clear a little bit, is that cast a vote for the identity you want. A workout isn't 5 push-ups, but it tells you that, I'm someone that I want to start doing this, that I'm starting slowly. And there's a thing I've used as well, the 1-minute plank for 30 days. 1 minute. Just do a plank for 1 minute. That sort of builds that habit that, I can do this. And then, how can I take it one level above and above? Just slowly. It's about slow steps.
So if it's a big task, set a goal
and break it down
for a small task that's going to take you 2 minutes or less, just so that you get started with whatever 100%. You need to do.
Yeah, you need
and
that
I think that makes a lot of sense, because when I find that if I'm putting something off, if I set something that I know I could complete in a couple of minutes, I get on that train. It becomes so much easier to start working on a task. If you do 5 push-ups, you're very likely to continue and just do a full-blown workout.
Yes.
Because you started with those 5 push-ups. So I think that's I think that's a really good tip for people who struggle with procrastination is try to reduce what your brain is looking at as punishment as much as possible. Because there's a certain element of it where your brain is thinking, why are you punishing me by doing 5 push-ups? Why are you punishing me by working on this PowerPoint presentation when I can be gratified by looking at cat videos?
100%.
That's what your brain's saying.
Yeah.
So you need to kind of teach it that this is not the first of all, you need to trick it into, this is not punishment because it's a short task. But then once your brain realizes it's not punishment, it gets better at it. And once you keep doing that, I think you can get into a flow where procrastination stops being so alluring because you've trained yourself against it.
Yeah, it's rewiring. Yeah.
But I think it's always going to be, for people who are prone to it, I think it's always going to be a struggle. But once you learn management techniques for the procrastination, it just gets easier.
It gets a bit, we can't eliminate it entirely, but you just need to sort of lessen it.
Yeah. And like we said, it's an emotional regulation thing. Yeah. And sometimes our emotions do get the better of us. And when they do, it's okay to forgive yourself.
No, 100%. One final point, actually, based on what we said, this is more in praise of procrastination and how procrastination actually benefited this situation. Rewinding the clock a little bit, Roman Empire, 3rd century, the Romans were at war with the Carthaginians in what is now modern-day Tunis. And the war was ongoing for, I think, a number, maybe 2-3 centuries. In this particular period, zooming into the action, Hannibal was the leader of the Carthaginians. He had invaded Italy. He had crossed the Alps with elephants, with a huge army, invaded Italy from the north, something that the Romans thought was outlandish, bizarre, ridiculous. And he arrives and starts massacring the Romans left and right, winning decisive battles in northern Italy. And the Romans are scrambling. So what they do is that they enlist a general called Quintus Fabius Maximus to lead the Roman army. And what he does was something that shocked the Roman Senate at the time. Realizing that they couldn't beat Hannibal in battles, he managed the delay. He procrastinated battles. He kept, and for 2 reasons. Number one is Hannibal is a foreign enemy in the Italian countryside, in foreign territory. He has shaky supply lines. He doesn't have, the logistics are against him, right? Towns can start not giving him supplies.
Yeah.
He has a huge army to feed and all that stuff. So that's number one in terms of food. Secondly is that he had a foreign army, Hannibal, that is made up of mercenaries. These people at the time, their mindset wasn't long sieges and long warfare, right? They wanted battle and go back home and so on. So he thought about, okay, if I can extend the fight and the battles and avoid a pitched battle, maybe I can exhaust them and I can avoid a siege on the city of Rome and slowly wear them down. And what he did, he kept delaying them, skirmishes and fights and here and there and annoying them and poking them. The problem is that it worked for a good period of time. Rome was able to sort of recalibrate and gather new troops and forces, but the Roman Senate actually opposed him, and he was facing internal clashes because of the pride of Rome. What are you doing? We need to fight and all that kind of stuff. You can imagine.
Yeah.
And so they removed him from the command, even though he was sort of successful by buying them time. It's a strategy to buy time. The very next consul or general that took over lost to Hannibal. And then the Romans eventually won, but they kind of retrospectively were like, okay, this guy actually did a good job.
Yeah.
And nowadays it's called the Fabian strategy. It's in military warfare. They call it the Fabian strategy, the art of delay. Is that when you're not capable of fighting a pitched battle, strategic delay actually helps you. George Washington used it in the American Revolution against the British. So it comes up. And just finally, there's actually a society in the UK called the Fabian Society, which is, an ode to that gentleman, Fabian, around slow changes over time is actually more beneficial than quick revolutions or quick, changes and reforms in a society. So this is sort of an interesting history buff around, delay and how procrastination can actually help you.
There's also a correlation between procrastination and creativity.
Perfect.
Sometimes if you can't come up with a specific idea or you have an idea but you're not sure how to package it, instead of forcing your brain to do something, put it off, and then your brain is just going to form neural connections because it's going to be in the back of your mind. You're going to think about it more while you're doing other things throughout your day, and you might end up with a better end product just because you put it off for a bit before you actually started it.
And then
so yeah, procrastination can be beneficial, but it's important to understand when it's going to become a detriment. If you're actively procrastinating, which is procrastinating knowing that you're procrastinating for a specific end goal, then you should do it, but it's a fine balance. Make sure that 100%. It doesn't affect the end goal that you're trying to accomplish.
100%.
But yeah, I think we can wrap up here.
This is it. I mean, it's been a good discussion. Again, it's a chronic condition. It affects us all. It's something that I don't think we can entirely eliminate. It's not going to go away, but it's just about managing.
Yeah.
And just how we set goals, how we plan, and how we find these tricks to hack our internal neural wiring, right?
Yeah, and there are obviously correlations between procrastination and certain mental afflictions like anxiety, ADHD,
100%,
that kind of thing. So for some people, not procrastinating is a lot harder than for others. For others, having really good time management and stuff comes much more naturally. If you're someone who is a lot more prone to procrastination, you just need to actively and mindfully regulate your own emotions a bit better, and you can overcome or at least manage procrastination to be much more productive in your life.
Yeah, which is the aim ultimately, right? It's just about, as you were saying, it's not about perfectionism. It's you want progress. You want to keep going.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
good
thanks,
stuff.
Sami.
Thank
good
you,
talk.
Tarek.
Thanks everyone for listening. We'll wrap up and see you next time.